Good evening, everybody. How is everyone? That was fantastic, very loud. I can't even hear you. There were all the voices coming out. Welcome to Liberty Forum 2018. My name is Mickey Mullen. I live in the People's Republic of New Jersey. I'm not actually here yet. I have friends who are free staters. They're good people, and so am I sometimes. So our first talk of the conference is going to be an interview by Jason Sorens for the welfare state and what it means to freedom. I'm going to let Jason take that from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mickey. Would it be possible to have Vera use that mic until Q&A so that we don't have to pass back and forth?
I don't see why not. Okay.
All right, thank you all and welcome. This is an event co-sponsored by Ethics and Economics Education of New England. Check us out at e3ne.org. We do high school programs, after-school programs for high school students called Ethics and Economics Challenge. We do events like this one every now and then, both on big ideas like this one and on state policy issues for legislators. So check us out, e3ne.org. We're also doing some dinners Friday and Saturday night, so feel free to come out. I'm very pleased that we have Veronique de Rugy with us, who's you may have seen on cable television, Fox News, and many other outlets, and a friend of mine for several years. Veronique is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, a nationally syndicated columnist. Her primary research interests include the U.S. economy, the federal budget, homeland security, taxation, tax competition, and financial privacy. She is the author of a weekly opinion column for the Creator Syndicate, writes regular columns for Reason Magazine, and she blogs about economics at National Review Online's The Corner. Previously, de Rugy has been a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a policy analyst at the Cato Institute, and a research fellow at the Atlas Economic Research Foundation. Before moving to the United States, she oversaw academic programs in France for the Institute for Humane Studies Europe. She received her MA in economics from the Paris Dauphine University and her PhD in economics from the Pantheon Sorbonne University. So welcome, Vero, and
thank you.
And welcome to the Free State.
Thank you.
Have you been to New Hampshire before?
I had not been to New Hampshire before.
Oh, wow. So this is...
that's very exciting.
That's right. And
I remember the first time I saw you talk about the Free State Project. I was at AEI at the time.
Oh, right. We did an event at AEI.
Wow, this guy's cool.
And actually, the woman who set that up ended up moving to New Hampshire. So, you know,
Yes.
we're drawing all the libertarians from around the world.
That's good. I can't commit quite yet.
Yes, well, that's understandable. You're probably doing more for liberty where you are than you could.
It's hard. It's an uphill battle. My parents laugh at me all the time. They said, wait, you left France and you moved to the center of a bureaucratic state in the United States?
The imperial capital. Yes. So,
and they never disappoint.
Well, why don't we start with that? I mean, so the topic for our discussion is the welfare state, good or bad for freedom. It's a little bit binary. Now, of course, the welfare state is an extremely complex topic. There are many different programs, some of which may have more costs.
126.
126.
Yeah.
Someone
well,
has
I mean,
counted this.
it's been cataloged. There's actually a great study by Michael Tanner at Cato. It's a 126 project, but I think I would add to those actually Social Security and Medicare. For one thing, it would piss off seniors to hear me call it a welfare program, but that's what it is. And Medicare, I would add that too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, their redistribution of wealth, so that should count. Whether we support it or not, that's what it is. Now, I'm sort of curious, starting off with your background in France. So by many measures, France has one of the largest welfare states in the world. even rivaling that of Scandinavia. How would you compare France to the U.S.? What is the French welfare state like? Some here in the U.S. admire the Nordic model. Are there advantages to these continental European welfare states, or do you see mostly disadvantages?
Well, I think there's a difference between the French model and the Scandinavian model. I think the Scandinavian models, first, these countries are smaller. I mean, culturally, it's also different, and I think we have to always be very careful about looking at a model in a different country and thinking that we can apply it to the U.S. I mean, there's a culture of individual rights in the U.S. that you just don't have in Europe. You just don't have it the way we have it here, and the idea that you could just transplant one system for another, even if people think, it seems appealing, I think is dangerous. But even the Scandinavian model is very different from the French model. I mean, they have actually reformed a fair amount their welfare states. They've moved a lot to cash payment. They've actually tried to shrink it, make it more efficient. And I think more importantly, what a lot of people who admire these regimes are saying is like, well, they have a big welfare state. Otherwise, they've actually really kind of moved up quite significantly on the index of freedom of the world, because they have opened their trade, lowered their regulations. They've done a lot. I mean, they've really improved their monetary policies. I mean, like Denmark is one that everyone always talks about, right? And it's just, I mean, and the reason why they rate so high is because out of the 5 different categories, there's really one that sucks if it's a fiscal one. And also, I mean, it's worth also noting for all the people who point out to these big, welfare countries that still grow, that they've actually kind of made their wealth before they were big, right? I mean, and France is actually a really good example. When I go back there, the French system has actually gone through no reforms whatsoever that the Scandinavian models have, and they're kind of like vaguely talking about doing this flexi whatever now, but it's France is an interesting thing, because there's a lot of wealth in France, but there's also there's just a lot of people unemployed. I mean, it's a big system, and like all those big systems, and the same is true, you see the number of people eligible and dependent on these programs have radically increased, while the level of poverty is defined by the poverty rate, we can talk about, has stayed constant. And unemployment rate has been hovering around 10% for a long time. Just think about it this way. And for young people, it's 20%. And 25% sometimes, and for some immigrants, it's like, in some communities, like 60%. I mean, this is what happens when you have an economy that is dragged down by everything, by the welfare state, which comes hand in hand with otherwise by regulatory policy. And people may not be dirt poor, but it's just not a really good life.
Yeah, I'm going to try to channel Will Wilkinson a little bit, since he's unable to be here, and I think would take more of a positive stance on the question whether the welfare state is good or bad for freedom. And ask you, so the unemployment in France, is that really a result of transfer programs, or is that a result of labor regulation? And can we recommend labor deregulation while at the same time advocating a strong safety net?
I mean, you can if you're not a libertarian, but well, I mean, I just think, honestly, to put it out there, I just think that I can understand people making the case for the welfare state. I mean, whatever the size you want, but I think that, and it's been actually really good for me to think about this before coming here. I just think it's just not possible to reconcile, welfare rights and individual rights. I just think that the argument that you can actually defend a strong welfare state as a libertarian based on the tradition of individual liberty is actually not possible. There are a lot of good reasons to maybe argue for a welfare state and saying, because we have one and there are transition costs to going to a pure libertarian movement. There's also, it's not practical at this state, or just, with age it become a squish. I'll say that about myself. You know, and I think it's hard to argue for the libertarian, you know, for the welfare state as a libertarian. That being said, yeah, you can always have, like in Denmark, for instance, you have their economies doing fairly well. You have a lot of low regulation, good trade policies, and all that stuff. And one of the arguments that Will would make is that, in fact, if you want a healthy welfare state, you need to be able to have a growing economy so the welfare state can feed off the capitalist, which right there in that definition tells you why there's a conflict with libertarianism, right there. I mean, I don't disagree with that. That's what you need. You need to have a lot of rich people that you can feed off, right? And so, but they are trade-offs. And even Will say this. It's like there are trade-offs. The economy will grow slower. Now the question is like, is this a trade-off we're willing to make?
So, how in general would you view policy deals like, let's say this package were on the table, we repeal the minimum wage and replace it with a wage subsidy or something like that, which would be a kind of transfer program. Maybe it's a tax credit, but nevertheless still providing cash to low-wage workers and eliminating a regulation.
Yeah. I mean, this is a fight that I fight all the time with my conservative friends and other of my free market friends who are always like pushing for programs in the name that they're not as bad as other programs. Like the Earned Income Tax Credit is a big darling of the left and of the right in the name as it is a name that it has a work requirement and it's like. And it's not as bad as the minimum wage, and I'm just kind of not ready. I'm ready to fight for freedom. I just think that we're not yet at the state where we should give up. And if you want to talk about compromises, right? I mean, the compromises that I would take now, because I also recognize that we can't move back, get rid of the welfare state, even if I knew for a fact, right, that it would be a much bigger, better system, which I believe in my heart, but like even if I knew for a fact, I would recognize that there are transition costs. A compromise that I would make is like, I would be like, let's shrink it all to one cash benefit, block grant the hell out of everything, and just give money to the states to let them deal with it. Instead of Social Security and Medicare, I would move away from age-based programs towards needs-based program, because seniors used to be overrepresented in the low-income quintile, and now they're overrepresented in the top income quintile, which means that basically Social Security has been proven to be a transfer of wealth, not just from the young to the relatively poor and young to the relatively old and rich. I say relatively because, but also it is a transfer from minorities and black to white people, from single to married people. And so I would do this. That's a compromise. That's a compromise from the pure libertarian ideal.
Of course, there are lots of welfare programs that we may not recognize as such. That we tend to think of welfare programs as transfers to the poor, but actually, if you look at social spending in the U.S., the vast majority of it, including Social Security and Medicare, go to middle and upper income households. But there's also this hidden welfare state, they call it in the U.S., of tax credits and deductions for mortgage interest, for employer-provided health insurance, for retirement contributions, and those, of course, benefit largely middle and upper income households. What do you think about those tax side social benefits? Are those also part of the welfare state? Should we also try to shrink those?
Yes, I think it's, so where we have to be careful when talking about what they call, it's called in the budget tax expenditures. And I would have to count them now with the tax reform because they've gotten rid of some of them. But before the tax reform, I actually wrote a paper on this. There were 177 of those tax breaks. Basically, departure from your actual income and you get a break either in the form of a deduction, a credit, or a reduced rates or something like this. And where we have to be careful is that while I would eliminate the hell out of all the tax expenditure, and they call it expenditure, it's as if, you know, everything in your income belongs to the government, which isn't the case. I would get rid of all of this because a lot of them serve special interests. We have to be very careful because some of these, and some of the biggest one, I think about, for instance,
Maybe charitable deduction.
well, actually, I'm against this.
Oh, really?
Also.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I don't advertise it because I'm in a 501c3. But when I have to write about this, I say what I think. But for instance, when you have the corporate income tax deferral, these type of tax expenditures are actually a way to mitigate the double taxation of income, and they're a good thing. So for instance, the special rate for capital gains, right? It's a lower rate. The left always want to get rid of this, saying it's unfair. No, actually, the actual rate should be zero. The fact that it's not taxed at a higher rate and you give it a preferential treatment is to avoid part of the double taxation.
Because corporate income's already taxed, is that the idea?
Yes, so, and a lot of these, like so for instance, for the corporate income tax, the deferral was because that income earned abroad was already taxed in a foreign country. So because we had a worldwide tax system, right, you would get a tax credit for the tax paid abroad, but that whole income had already been taxed. So anyway, long story short, people want to always talk about those tax expenditures as if they're just all of the same, all special interests, that we can all let the government put their hands on it and we would all be better off. But actually the reality is, until we move to a tax base that's not income-based, and we're always going to need these.
Right.
But I would, yes, definitely just get rid of the mortgage interest deduction, get rid of the health employer base. Again, this is the biggest one. Plus, I mean, it's not just unfair, but it has actually created so many distortions in terms of the price of healthcare and all of that stuff that there's so many reasons to get rid of them.
Yeah, it's really enlightening. If any of you are interested in comparing size of the welfare state across countries, you can go to the OECD Stats website, and they have a little drop-down menu there, and you can choose net social spending. And that has everything in it. That has all social spending by government, from the tax side, the spending side, by employers. And the US actually is the third highest as a percentage of GDP. So we actually spend a lot on social programs, but maybe don't get a lot for it. Is that fair to say? I mean, are there ways that we could actually
We got a
reduce?
lot of poor, right?
Yeah, could we, we have a very high poverty rate in this country.
Well, yeah.
Could we do more to reduce poverty without
What's
money?
kind of interesting about the poverty rate, we can debate. I mean, I think actually it's a very bad measure of actual poverty in the U.S., especially because standard of living have improved thanks to the market economy, thanks to capital, thanks to innovators, right? It's just your dishwasher doesn't do the same thing for you now than it used to do, and your telephone, your TV, your everything, right? But the poverty rate in the U.S. since the war on poverty has started has actually stopped kind of going down, and it's stuck at this 15-something%, even though the welfare state, due to eligibility standards changing dramatically and programs being added, in fact, it exploded. So yeah, you don't get a very good return on investment for sure.
So one idea to help address this problem is to get rid of these so-called eligibility cliffs, where you can lose all of your benefits if you go over an income threshold. So a single mother making $18,000 a year, if she were to take a job making $21,000 a year, might lose Medicaid benefits, and therefore all the benefit plus some of getting that new job or taking on a second job and working more hours. And so one idea that's out there that Will, for instance, has supported is replacing these means-tested programs with a universal basic income, where everyone gets a monthly cash grant, no matter how much you make, so that you don't lose it as you make more, and maybe that would actually encourage work. What do you think about that kind of idea?
Well, I think the idea of getting rid of most bureaucrats is delightful to me. It's funny, when I'm interviewed, I'm always put in the camp of the pro basic income, where in the end I can't support it. But it is true that there is something about the design, even though if I think about it a bit more, the idea of taxing everyone to give back money to everyone is just totally insane. It's kind of like the gas tax. It's like, let us tax you, the government, the bureaucracy takes its cut and then sends it back to the states. It's insane. Ultimately, unless you get rid of absolutely everything, and by absolutely every poverty program, I also mean Social Security, I mean Medicare, I mean the minimum wage laws, I mean a lot of things, and you guarantee that they can't come back, there's just no way I'm signing up for any of that stuff. Even if, even though I do recognize that there's an elegance to the design, and I like the fact that it's not paternalistic. I mean, we have 33 housing welfare program currently now, 33. Like, if you're poor, you're screwed, because you have to navigate all of that, right? And then the government, a bureaucrat in Washington is telling you, you can spend that much on housing, and then there's I can't remember, I think it's like 12 or something like this, food programs, that much on food. And it's just awful. And then on top of that, right, with food stamps, there's always these debates of whether we should tell you that you can't buy soda because God knows, people who are poor can't make any responsible decision ever. So I like the lack of paternalism of design like this, and it's not a coincidence that libertarians have actually, talked a lot about this. It's not just Charles Murray, but Hayek has talked about it. Buchanan, Friedman. There's something about universality that is appealing, and again, cutting all these bureaucrats sounds just really good to me, but I can't. Still.
A lot of libertarians will say something like this, that I ideally would abolish the welfare state, but I don't think we should end anti-poverty programs until we've abolished all corporate welfare. I've heard this now and then. What do you think about that kind of statement?
Well, I don't think it's one or the other. I think we should get rid of all corporate welfare. I mean, I'm against all subsidy to any private corporations, period. But I don't know why you should not do the right thing on the welfare side until you can do the right thing with the corporate side, with the corporate welfare, or vice versa. So it's not an argument I buy. I'm more sensitive actually to the fact that we can't get rid of the welfare state because civil society has been destroyed by the welfare state. And right now it would be a transition that would be horrific. And also, I'm more sensitive to an argument, even though it's far from a libertarian argument, but I'm okay with that. That I'm okay with a system that actually really gives money to poor people, to really poor people, whether they're poor because it's their fault or not. I'm with age, I've grown comfortable. I'm comfortable with that. But just waiting for one thing to happen to tackle another is actually not a good argument.
Some people would argue that, and I've heard this claim as well, and this claim I think is just wrong, but I want to see what you think about it, if you can explain why this is wrong, because it seems to be very widespread, this idea that welfare programs actually subsidize businesses. Right? So you'll hear people say that McDonald's is subsidized by the welfare state because they can pay people less and expect that their employees will then make benefits. Is that right, or is there something wrong with that logic?
Well, I mean, it doesn't sound right to me. Unless McDonald's is heavily lobbying the government to put in place these programs in order to do this, you know. I mean, we all live with the consequences, good or bad, of government intervention, right? So it's not a very appealing, and usually it comes from people who want more welfare state.
That's right, yes.
So more
and
minimum wage,
wages.
higher minimum wage laws, and I will say this, I'm more in favor, talking about trade-offs. I think I'm completely against using the tax code to subsidize anything, you know, for people or companies or whatever. I'm also completely against using private companies to achieve social goals against their wills, because usually it's a one-size-fits-all, and by this I mean, you know, the minimum wage and a bunch of things like this. I would rather have actually spending programs, just more transparent spending programs, because at least we can see them. We can monitor them. I mean, can we reverse them? It's hard, but I would prefer. I'm always saying you want, and that maybe to your question. If I was forced to choose between wage subsidies and the minimum wage, I would take the wage subsidies. If I was forced, if I had no choice, if I were like in Belgium where I was forced to vote, like that, right? But otherwise, I'm still young enough that I'm like, nah, I won't choose between two bad options. But if I were, I'd prefer a system that's more transparent.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that occurs to me is that to the extent that these welfare programs actually do reduce labor supply, if you believe that people are less willing to work because of these welfare programs, then they should actually be harming, I think, low-wage businesses, because they make it harder for them to find employees. They actually have to pay higher wages to attract those employees. So anyway.
I just never quite understood the argument for the minimum wage from the perspective of the left. I mean, it clearly makes labor more expensive, and I just can't imagine. Maybe I'm just so narrow-minded that there's a part of the real world that I just, you know, can't figure out. But that a low-skilled worker who's suddenly made more expensive is actually more attractive. I just don't get that. It seems that that person is less attractive in any possible scenario. And I'm always baffled by argument to the contrary.
Well, we've got about 5 minutes left, so I wanted to give you two very philosophical questions, I suppose. And see what you think.
I will suck at it.
So one is maybe less overtly philosophical, but it asks you, if you saw evidence and were persuaded of the evidence that having welfare programs available made people more willing to vote for free market policies in other areas, I think this is something that Will would argue, would that make you, at least on the margin, more favorable to welfare programs? And then second of all, what do you think about the libertarian argument for, sometimes this is cashed out as an argument actually for the universal basic income, which goes something like this, that the Lockean proviso says that, well, private property is only justified, we're only justified in getting private property out of the earth and appropriating it if it works out for everyone's benefit. Otherwise, they have some reason to complain. They have a reason, they could say, well, if the whole world were unowned, yes, we'd all be poor, but at least I'd be able to survive. I could go, you know, pick berries on the bushes or whatever. And so some people say, as a kind of compensation to people who can't survive in a market economy very well, we should have this kind of cash transfer, and they justify kind of welfare state on the basis of that. So if you feel comfortable taking that question, you're welcome to, but otherwise the first one.
I mean, so your first question is like, I'd like to see evidence that, you know, welfare makes you more prone to support market policies. I mean, I can't think of anything right now unless you have a specific example. I mean, one of the problem, I mean, there is a real problem, and it's not for it's not for everyone, but I mean, there's a lot of evidence, right, that the welfare state does breed dependency, and people being more willing to get out of the labor force, the labor market, and give up actually moving up the ladder, taking that trek up the wage ladder, which is hard. You see it with disability insurance. You see it with a lot of programs, and especially for people who are just right at this margin of the level where they will lose. I mean, the marginal tax rates for those people who are working, you know, a little bit more, making a little bit more money is just
Over 100% sometimes.
It's over 100%, yes. So it creates dependency for sure, not for everyone, but for a lot of people. So I just can't see. Maybe Will would have an example of this. And the other one was what? I can't remember.
So the other one is basically the lock-in.
Oh, the lock-in
argument,
thing. Well, I think kind of another way that people formulate that argument is the fact that the reason for the universality, the reason for the support for Social Security, that is everyone gets it, right? That if you actually have programs that are specifically targeted for people, then they wouldn't have a wide range support. So it's possible that it's actually the case that this may be true. I don't think it makes it right? I don't think it makes it right, but.
Well, why don't we turn things over to Q&A now, and maybe I will give my mic up. Does that work? I can do
Actually, why
that.
don't you just straighten?
Okay, let's just do mics in.
So anyone who has a question, would you please come up here, because this is the microphone that I have for you. And if you know you have a question, you may as well follow so that we don't have to wait for you to walk up after this gentleman.
Gentlemen, oh.
Thank you for an excellent give and take. I have two questions. Number one, some people feel that any act of giving money and power to the government, including those functions which are normally considered constitutional under our U.S. Constitution, is bad because, okay, if you give money and power to a welfare state, you increase the size of government, and needless to say, they'll use that to oppose other things or promote other things. That's one issue. Can you comment on a cause and effect of any act of money and power to the government? And number two, you mentioned Social Security, and a lot of people don't like the idea because our government likes to misappropriate that money. They'll take money that was part of the Social Security Trust Fund and use it for, well, whatever they damn well feel like. Can you comment on those two things, please?
Yes. So, yes, I mean, at the base of government is coercion through taxes. So, I mean, there's no debate. I think it was a concern, Madison, right? Isn't that what Madison, the Federalist Paper 10 or 51, can't remember, is about? I mean, this notion that you have a government and it grows. I mean, the incentives within government are very clear. They're to misspend. I mean, they don't have the incentive that we have to spend our own money, let's put it this way, because they're not spending it on themselves, and it's not their money. I mean, I think Milton Friedman said that well. So yeah, I mean, there's no debate that this is why the government is so big, right? It's just the government grows because it also has the power to kind of spread the cost on a few and concentrate the benefits. So no debate. For me, well, I think there's multiple reasons to really, really profoundly dislike Social Security, and that's one of those. I mean, well, that's a reason to dislike the government, which spends its time breaking its word and and doing things that it's not supposed to do. And incidentally, it does this with the earned income tax credit, right? It's like the way Social Security is designed, or even when we got, do you remember that payroll tax cut we got? I mean, the idea behind is like the payroll tax, that money goes into the trust fund for paying benefits for, right now, for current beneficiaries and future beneficiaries, because Social Security has been running a cash flow deficit since 2010. So we rely on the assets in the trust fund to basically pay full benefits. But when it does it all the time, which is basically it puts, because it gives back money for the earned income tax credit or during this payroll tax holiday, right? There's phantom revenue that goes into the trust fund from general revenue. So it goes both ways. They take the money for other things, and they also, take general revenue money to pay for benefits. It's not a reliable system.
Thank you.
And it's insolvent. I mean, it's massively insolvent. I mean, in 2035, at the latest, benefits will be cut by 25%. We've known this for a long, 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 long time, and no one wants to do anything about it.
Hi, it's not a question specifically, but can you speak to the impact that welfare programs have on economic privacy? Because they require the government's intervention into a lot of aspects of our lives that really we shouldn't have to tell them about.
Yeah, I mean, but that's true for everything. That's true. I mean, at the heart, I mean, the income tax, right? That's what the income tax does. It's when you have to turn over all of your records to the government so it can take its cut, or make sure that you don't owe them more money than you've already given them throughout the year with withholding. So welfare is just one of the many ways. And by the way, as I said earlier on, it could be way worse, right? It could be. I mean, there's a lot of push for making sure that food stamps are not spent on this or that, or are only spent on local markets, or I mean, I was like listening to someone yesterday at Dartmouth who was telling me that in New York, the value of food stamps when you shop at the local market is double. I don't know exactly how it works, but because those goods are so expensive, if you pay $1, it actually buys you $2, right? Well, there's a whole source of proposal from libertarians, and I can understand, there's part of me that can understand the paternalism and saying, if you're going to be living off my money, I want to be sure that you're not drinking soda, and you're not becoming obese, and you're not going to die and be a drain on me through Medicaid. I mean, it's inevitable. That's the nature of government. It has to know your stuff to be able to take your stuff.
Two questions. One is, I'm wondering, with the new global economy, where all capitalism is based on that money's being made globally, it's being manufactured globally, so it's not happening locally, how we cannot institute like a standard, either a minimum wage or a standard income, because I just see so much money being made. I mean, like Facebook, they're going to make millions and millions because it's a global product, but if there's not a standard of wages or an income, then we're all going to be just serving each other meals and doing much more low-income, localized jobs. So I'm wondering about that. And then my second question is it seems like with all three parties, it's based on a materialistic consumerist model, which is no longer sustainable. And we cannot just keep on consuming and buying disposable vacuums and disposable phones. I mean, it's just not healthy. So how do we change the model so that we're not all living off of welfare, but we're not just these consumers, buy, shop, work, buy, shop, work?
I think if you want to change the model, starts by changing you, and maybe convince the guy next to you and the guy next to you to join your party. Or you join your lifestyle. But I don't think there's a way. At first, I'm not sure that consumerism is a bad thing. I mean, a lot of people owe their living to the fact that we buy a ton of stuff.
Well, that's my point, is having our economy based on that model is not sustainable.
It's more sustainable than the welfare state.
Well, that's what, I don't think it's one against the other. I mean, I'm saying that both models are bad.
Well, I fail to see why the consumerism, what's the standard for judging that it's bad? And I think that with the difference, actually, I will contrast. Let's even assume that both of them are bad. The difference with bad behavior in the private sector is that when it becomes really bad, it actually can be changed. It has the flexibility. There will be forces that, like group of people who decide to change. And look, I know with smoking, there's been a lot of government campaigns, but it didn't. Actually, the best example is food. The government has misled people for years and years and years because they had the wrong information about what we should eat. The changes in the way we eat in the U.S. is actually changing because of the private sector. So if consumerism is such a problem, right, I actually believe that the private sector, driven by private people who think and identify that this is a problem, will find a way to change this. At least there's a hope in the private sector. It's not a guarantee, but with the government, unfortunately, there's a tendency for inertia, and there are a lot of incentives to keep things the way they are, so you can keep on pleasing special interests.
Well, is that true though? Because I mean, when I lived in Sweden, what I saw that with their socialized medicine is that there was a big, huge social pressure and even government regulations to ensure that there was good, healthy eating in the schools and in the country, where, so, you know, it was kind of like a government and a social construct, because your medical bill is based on your eating well. I mean, here with it being private and the government not being involved, then it's like, you know, there's no longer food, it's food like 47 cents of every healthcare dollar spent comes from the government. So I think it's hard to say that actually our healthcare is exclusively. But and the system you describe, the system you describe in Sweden, it sounds horrifying to me. While I believe in role modeling, I don't want it to come from the government, because again, governments in all countries, even the most health conscious ones, have actually been wrong for a long time about what health, health is like, I would rather we change our behaviors based on learning than having the government impose it top down, because when they make a mistake, and they often make a mistake, they just don't change the direction for a long time. Look at the war on drugs, right? I mean, the war on drugs is a perfect example of a government dictating and telling you this is a bad thing. You should not be smoking pot. You shouldn't be doing things.
Hang on, for anything more on this, perhaps you're discussing after. We have about 3 minutes for this last question and answer together.
So this is you guys teased on this before about the universal basic income. We talked about this at last Liberty Forum about the kind of the moral case for this. Inside what Jason asked about encouraging people to be in the market. So if you have a UBI, and this is kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if your food and your shelter is taken care of, a lot of the fear basis of not being on welfare, not having a social net is gone. So if okay, well, I'm not going to starve, I'm going to roof over my head, you can get a job, because if you want to have fun, you need money. So in addition to all that, if we could just magically eliminate 99% of the welfare state and just have this one program, assuming we could solve that, do you think there is actually a moral case for something like UBI if the public is going to want a welfare state of some sort? That maybe that could have some of this virtuous effects. If people aren't worried about their safety and their health and their security, that they will therefore be in the market more often.
So, it's an argument I hear a lot, but I'd like to remind everyone that this was Roosevelt's idea behind the welfare state, right? Freedom from wants. We have, these welfare programs, for some people are extremely generous, right? They're really generous. It's not enough to live the life, and realistically, a UBI would not be more than $12,000 a year, or let's say even 20. And the problem we've seen with the freedom from wants is actually it doesn't actually trigger the willingness now that you don't have that anxiety from trying to find food, from trying to find housing. It doesn't actually trigger this, okay, well now I can be an entrepreneur, now I can go out. In fact, we've seen that it has the opposite effect of saying, well, that's enough because I don't want, and some of it is the design of these programs are bad, but they have inherently in them disincentive they create real disincentive to work. And in cases where UBI has been tried, we've seen the same thing. It's been tried in several states, and the same disincentive exists. So this is an argument that's been said over and over again for welfare. It's an argument that's been presented for UBI. I don't think it's correct. I would rather, someone who just says we should take care of poor people. I just give them money, even if they sit on their hands the rest of the day. I think that's a more honest argument than just saying, once you protect people from, absolute starvation and the fear of having to sleep in the street, it's going to create this desire to work. It doesn't really work always this way.
Thank you very much.